Hi, this is Abby Bishop, and this is my assessment of student learning. So, looking at student benchmarks that they took at the beginning of this semester, my students struggled with mechanics, and one area that I noticed that they really struggled with was capitalization rules and using proper capitalization and identifying words that used proper capitalization. So these are the actual examples from within the benchmark that students took, which asked them to identify words and sentences that had proper capitalization. And just so that you know, I gave this test verbally, so I read most answers or questions and choices aloud to students so that they would be able to select them with their best knowledge. So, however, looking at number 31, you can see that all of the answers say dad. You just have to know which one uses the correct capitalization. So, and here are those questions again, just written out. So I also used a teacher-created pre-assessment to ensure that this is a skill that I really should work on with my students. So in the pre-assessment, I wanted to measure if students were able to use proper capitalization for months and for names. So the assessment question and prompt that I designed had students either writing about their best friend, and I made sure that they named their best friend, and also, or another option was writing about their pet. Some students who didn't have a pet still chose to write about that and wrote about their dream pet, or kind of made up some information about a pet. The one on the right, he wrote about my dog, Pepper. So, who I talk about a lot. So a lot of the kids kind of take ownership of her and will write about her. So with the information that I gathered from both of these assessments, the benchmark and the teacher-created pre-assessment, I found that scores were kind of scattered for students, but that no one was really able to consistently identify or write using proper capitalization for names and other proper nouns. So the goal that I initially set was that by April 21st, 80% of my students would be able to write sentences with common and proper nouns capitalized correctly using interactive writing with at least 80% of accuracy 80% of the time. And this kind of came from, the accuracy part came from the amount of assessments that I used and check-ins that I kind of used along the way in between the two lessons that I taught. So I ended up having 8 products that I could measure student accuracy with. So in having my goal, I was able to start the process of researching instructional decisions and choosing research that would best fit with my students and their needs in this particular goal. But first I looked at their IEP goals. So I found that most all of my students have goals about writing, whether it's fine motor or it's the actual writing product, whether they're writing opinion or about an event in their life, or if it's just spelling. Almost all of my students have goals on writing, which goes with the first grade territory. And a lot of the deficits that my students have are in writing, and demonstrating their learning through writing is a big part of a lot of the assessments that they do at school. So it's something important to work on. As I said, the goals all fall in the areas of fine motor, letter formation, opinion writing, composition, and or spelling. So this was a good area to focus on my students. And as I told Dr. Elford, writing is one area that I really wanted to improve on. And this assignment kind of gave me that room and that motivation to really focus on writing instruction and implementing it daily in my classroom. And so I'm really happy to say that this assignment really helped me to incorporate daily writing instruction into my classroom. So the instructional decisions that I made were on the research that best suited my students. So the first one is interactive writing. So interactive writing provides powerful demonstrations of writing that help young children make progress in their own writing. It entails that classes create writing products together as students go through the graduated levels of support. So first, as a teacher, I would model, proper writing, and in this case, proper capitalization of nouns, proper nouns. And then slowly, as I worked into that we do phase, students would come to the board and practice that and apply their knowledge of that in our group writings. And then finally, past the interactive writing portion, when students were to create independent products, they would do the I do component of that graduated levels of support. I also use mnemonic devices, and they have been proven to be beneficial when explicitly discussing and describing a strategy. So in this case, that's capitalization and mechanics. So the acronym or mnemonic device that I used is MINTS, which helps students to break down the areas where they capitalize their letters. And the letter I focused in on most of my lessons was in names. So using uppercase letters at the beginning of names, which is the most obvious, I guess, proper noun. I also did some research on collaboration and found that when, as a teacher, I can generate high expectations for reading and writing while providing time to share and discuss, and that helps create a higher level of literacy engagement in students. So collaboration is something that I sometimes use in the past, but I've really been intentional about implementing it more because I really find that students do become more engaged and more excited about their learning when they get to share it with their peers. Finally, I used authentic application, which is something that I was really passionate about and that I talked a lot with my mentor teacher in. And this just means that I really wanted to make sure that when teaching grammar, I wasn't just teaching a skill and having students practice it on like a worksheet or, a cute activity, but that they were authentically applying their learning to writing situations, because that's where this skill is going to come into play for the rest of their lives and in writing. And it's an important skill to learn at this age and to be able to practice it in a real way. So in my first lesson, I had students using the appropriate capitalization for the names of people and the date that they used, and I did it through a letter. So students wrote a thank you letter to some volunteers we had in the classroom a few weeks prior to the lesson. And so I really focused in on, the name of the month, which is a proper noun, and using an uppercase letter for it, and then also the name of the visitor in addressing the letter to them. And in the third lesson, students, I focused in on just names, as I'll get into more in my reflection. It was a little overwhelming trying to address two areas for capitalization, and so I broke it down to names for the rest of the learning unit. So the measurement tools. First off, the standard that I looked at for this was a Common Core state standard for first grade, and it is capitalizing dates and names of people. So the learning unit objective kind of broken down, as I said, once after I taught that first lesson and found that, it's a little bit too much at this age for my students to learn both in a lesson, or two areas to use capitalization in just one lesson. So I really wanted to break it down to make sure students were able to really master the skill of capitalizing proper nouns in names specifically. So the measurement that I used was just looking at student work samples and identifying if they had used an uppercase letter at the beginning of a name. And as I said in the first lesson, I did date too, so that was something I looked at as well. So as I'll show you later, I used a chart for each student and a monitoring sheet to determine if they met the standard or in the goal. If they did not meet the standard or the goal and didn't use an uppercase letter for a name, or if it wasn't measurable. I do have a few students who really sometimes have a difficult time producing work, and they need a lot of support to be able to do that. And so this is something that I kept in mind as I plan lessons and plan for the accommodations and the ways that students could represent their learning. So not measurable just means that I wasn't able to tell if they mastered the standard or demonstrated the standard or not, because they didn't produce a product. So as I was saying, I used a record log to keep track of all the different assessments. So from the pre-assessment to the first lesson, I had some journal writings in there. And then I also had the final lesson. So from lesson 1, here are some of the work samples. As I said, we did a lesson on writing names beginning with uppercase letters and months in the format of a letter. Here are some of the journals that my students have been working on throughout the learning unit. And, as you can see on the left, some students, they just label pictures. That's the level that they're at. This is a kindergarten student right here who joined my class kind of in the middle of the unit. And then in the middle is a student who was writing a response to actually a Dr. Seuss book we read, and they used the characters' names to kind of make predictions about what happened after the story ended. And then on the right, you'll see one of my students who wrote about his dog again. So these are just examples of where students have been able to apply their learning in journal writing throughout the unit. In lesson 3, students wrote about a dog that we were going to get at our imaginary police unit in our classrooms. They wrote what the dog's name was going to be, and I made sure to really make that clear that they needed to write the dog's name and make a spot just for that, so that I could easily identify if they had mastered the goal of writing using an uppercase letter at the beginning of a name. So looking at all of these work samples, so looking at lesson 1, 7 of my students met the objective for writing an uppercase letter for a name here. 2 of my students were not present for the lesson. They hadn't yet joined my class, and 1 student did not meet the objective. In lesson 3, 2 of my students did not meet the standard in the objective of using an uppercase letter at the beginning of a name, but 8 of my students did meet it. So again, my goal was that I wanted 80% of my students to be able to write sentences with common and proper nouns capitalized correctly. with at least 80% accuracy 80% of the time. And like I said, here are my record logs that I use to keep track of this data. So in the end, 6 of my students met the student-centered learning goal by demonstrating the objective in at least 80% of the writing activities, and 4 of my students have not yet met the student-centered learning goal. Here are my references. So in reflecting on this process, I have learned that it's crucial to focus on one skill at a time. I tried to cram a few different areas for mechanics and capitalization into my first lesson, which was not the right decision. Students were just learning about capitalization of proper nouns, and I needed to start with the basics. But I tried to squeeze in a few different areas in there, and it just created confusion for my students. And they really relied on my modeling, even in the assessment process. They weren't able to complete the assessment independently. So I feel like my results are a little bit skewed just because students really relied on my help to be able to complete the assessment. Also, I have found that continual practice has been key in my students who have been successful with this learning goal. They were able to practice writing daily, and some days they were able to incorporate their knowledge of the capitalization of names into their writing, and I think that really helped them commit this new knowledge to their repertoire and to help them draw upon it in multiple settings and multiple experiences. I have really found that my knowledge that data drives instruction has been validated through this process. I've seen how effective teaching doesn't just simply happen, just falls into your lap. It doesn't. It takes a lot of effort to look at student data, to make a goal for student learning and a plan for how to meet all your students' different needs, and using evidence-based practices to really be able to teach with confidence that this is going to work for your students because it is based on research and practice in classrooms across the country and sometimes across the world. So I've really enjoyed this process and getting to kind of reflect along the way and how it's working and what changes need to be made. But it's been a great learning experience, and I look forward to applying it to my teaching practice in the future and for my career as a teacher.